In this video, we're going to continue on our exploration of Hellenistic culture. So here I'm going to begin with making a contrast, a very general contrast between Hellenistic culture and Semitic culture, because as Greek influence came much stronger into the area of Palestine, there would have been a lot of Jews who would then had to react to this and what are the differences really between the ways in which many Jews living in an agrarian culture primarily, how they would have responded to Hellenistic culture. So Hellenistic culture can be described this way. Generally, it is urban, so it focuses on the city as the place where civilization develops. It is where people have power, influence, resources, where the individual flourishes. It is polytheistic. It recognizes there are many gods, and the different gods should be respected, and how to work with the different gods in order to get the best advantages for life. It's metaphysical in that it does think about ideas and concepts. It does think about that there is a world outside of the one that is tangible. Of course, there were philosophers that did try to push back against this kind of metaphysical concepts, but generally speaking, most Greeks would have understood that there is this other world which the gods live and where there is other things that exist. It is speculative in that Greeks don't mind pursuing truth by asking questions, by exploring things. So if someone's familiar with Paul coming into Athens and then finding the philosophers and thinkers and who hear his idea about Jesus and the resurrection and wanting to find out more about this new God. I mean, that's a good characteristic of the speculative mind of Greeks. They want to know more, that there is more to know. It is universal and synchristic, meaning that there is truths in other cultures and that people can learn from one another. Now, they're obviously for Hellenistic individuals, or for at least for the Greeks, they gave a preference to their own Greek culture as being somehow another superior. That doesn't mean that there isn't other things that can be learned from other cultures. And in Hellenistic culture, there's also a lot of emphasis on the individual. Now, while community is very important and where one place finds honor within the community is obviously very important, one's identity is wrapped up in the household. There's also an emphasis on what the individual can pursue for themselves, finding out truth for themselves, pursuing things for their individual progression. So this emphasis on the individual certainly will continue to make a huge impact in later generations, because particularly Western culture is focused on the individual. So when we look at this and compare it to Semitic culture tends to be primarily rural, agricultural. So many Jews are living off the land. And now, I mean, Hellenistic people as well lived off the land. You had farmers, you had great big land owners, but in Semitic cultures, you have a lot of people who actually physically labor on the land. And a lot of their goods then obviously would have to go to villages and towns to be sold or things to be traded. But for a lot of Jews, there wouldn't have to be a need to go into a city. Cities would not be necessarily the places where one thrives or prospers. It is monotheistic. That we need a little asterisk here by monotheistic. Yes, they believe in Yahweh, but that doesn't mean they don't believe in other gods with a little g, or that there aren't other spirits or beings. Now, none of these spirits or beings is the creator of the world, creator of all things. No God is a creator of something that Yahweh is not the ultimate creator of. So they may have believed that there were these other gods or spirits or powers that existed, but only God, Yahweh, should be worshipped. None of these other gods should be worshipped. It's very physical in the sense of trying to make sense. Well, I mean, obviously they believe in supernatural things, non-physical things, but they do tend to think about life and about how to live life from physically what happens to an individual and physically what occurs. It's practical in the sense of what works. You know, big questions about what is truth, what is beauty. You know, trying to define these things in this more kind of speculative philosophical way. That's not was not typically of most Jews living in Palestine in the first and second century BC and the first century AD. Particularism and isolationism, in that for many Jews, Jewish faith, Jewish identity, Jewish culture is particular, it is unique. They are a holy people, a chosen people. They have a unique, special relationship as God's covenant people. They are ways in which they should not act like the other nations. So they are particular. And not everybody can be them. Now, other people can worship Yahweh, you know, as a non-Jew. That doesn't mean you have to become a Jew, but they have a unique place in the world. And they also can be isolationists. In other words, there is a concern for the influences of other cultures and what those other cultures bring. So here you can see if Hellenism is coming and wanting to learn other things and wanting to share ideas, discuss ideas. In Semitic culture, there's more of a concern of what those ideas might mean, what they could do, how they could distort, how they could lead away people. So they tend to want to keep a distance, as it were. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people in Hellenistic culture that also wanted to keep a distance, but, you know, we're talking generally here in terms of the movement of Greek thought, Greek ideas across the Eastern world. And also there's an emphasis on community. So what a person should be, how a person should act, how a person can thrive and flourish is a lot defined by its community. And this will be very important in reading the biblical text, particularly the New Testament, because a lot of the New Testament, when either the Apostle Paul or Peter or somebody else is writing to churches, is who they write to. The Oftentimes, if they use the language "you" in Greek, that actually might be a plural "you" because he's addressing the group and how the group is transformed or how the group develops, not so much how individual. Of course, each individual contributes to that overall growth, but a lot of the ways in which Paul and other Jews would have thought was that God works within communities. He helps individuals within that community context. So, some indicators that Hellenization is occurring. So, there becomes democratic structures and interactions in synagogues and then in the Sanhedrin. So, people know about the Sanhedrin. Jesus brought before the Sanhedrin. So, the Sanhedrin is basically like a boule, a council of, elders or aristocratic leaders, influential people in Jerusalem. Now there's a lot we don't know about the Sanhedrin and its authority. Of course, we have this story about Paul, getting permission from the high priest or maybe the Sanhedrin to go after, Christians who get dispersed after Stephen's martyrdom. So it's not really quite clear how that authority would have worked. That Paul could have had authority to go to a place like Damascus and arrest or round up other people. So I don't know how Damascus authorities would have perceived such an action. But nevertheless, this idea of collective decision making. Um, so there are some democratic structures, but also, of course, there is not maybe democracy in the way in which it's oftentimes thought of in the Western world, because you still have a kind of a hierarchy of structure from an emperor to a governor to a proconsul to other administrators like a high priest. So I mean, you do have structures that are there of individuals, but there's also a participation, a sharing, as it were, in the administration. So there is religious syncretism that's going on where people are uh, being open or engaging, as it were, with the non Jews. So, Jesus, for instance, is oftentimes described as someone who sits with tax collectors and sinners. Well, you have to think about a little bit about that combination of people, tax collectors and sinners. Who are these sinners? And this is a term that the term sinner could be used by a Jew for other Jews if they thought the other Jews were engaged in behavior that made them look like Gentiles. So if there was a Jew who saw another Jew not observing the Sabbath, not observing food laws, uh, maybe getting too cozy with the gods of others. In other words, kind of turning a blind eye towards paganism or idolatry. Those people would be called by others sinners. And so when we see Jesus sitting down with sinners and tax collectors, because tax collectors are people who are working for the Romans, and as the Romans, how do they make themselves friends to the Romans? Do they have to acknowledge things, accept things, give praise to things that maybe to others look like, well, you're kind of selling out. You're not keeping distinctive Jewish cultures and Jewish traditions. So we especially see this in astrology later on, or we will have evidence of Jews who will accept or utilize the Greek zodiac signs in creating amulets. So the activities of magic. So sometimes we will find even in the Book of Acts that there are Jews who are kind of working with um, non-Jewish rulers or Roman authorities, and they might be a sorcerer or a magician. But there's always limits as well. While you had this syncretism that was going on, at least for many Jews, there had to be boundaries of what could be allowed. And so when we see Paul writing to Christians, some who have been Jewish, they're Jewish Christians. They see themselves as Jews, but also as people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and who are now in a community, oftentimes with non-Jews who also want to recognize Jesus as a Messiah or as a Savior figure, deliverer figure. As they may interact with each other, they have to recognize that there may be also boundaries, things that cannot be done. So philosophical inquiry, influenced a lot by Platonism and Stoicism, and this is expressed particularly in the use of allegory. So we'll see that Jesus has things called parables, and some parables work like allegories, where one thing stands for another. And also, though, the avoidance of anthropomorphic language or imagery for God. So, while the Greeks can think about gods being represented in idols, they represent the god. They aren't the god themselves, but they represent the god, and you can represent gods with arms, hands, faces, bodies. Um, it becomes important for Jews not to confuse Yahweh in this way. So, not thinking or talking about God anthropomorphically. Of course, Jesus does use anthropomorphic language to describe God. He will talk about God as Father. And so Jews can understand that, thinking about God as their father or a creator or a person who exercises authority over them. But there would seem to be more of a reluctance to think about God or to express um, God with that type of language. So I'm going to finally end here with Jewish responses to the crises that's going on here. There, particularly with Hellenism, there is this growth of particularism. So there became more of an emphasis on ceremonial cleanliness. It's quite interesting to observe that in Galilee, particularly, archaeological evidence has discovered a number of what we call mikvotes. Mikvotes are little baths that were used for ceremonial cleansing. And so it looks like many Jews in Galilee were interested in the process of ceremonial cleanliness, even though there wasn't much of a need to be cleansed if they weren't going to engage in something that required that cleanliness. So uncleanliness is the thing that happens naturally. It's not necessarily sinfulness, although you can commit sins that make you unclean. But a lot of times people become unclean just as a natural part of life. But you didn't have to worry about becoming clean unless you were going to go and offer a sacrifice, or if you were going to go and touch something or do something that was supposed to bring you into contact with God or draw nearer to God. But the fact that there are these mikvotes, so many mikvotes discovered in Galilee that may date back to the first century, shows that there may have been quite an interest amongst Jews to have these pools to wash themselves for ceremonial cleanliness purposes. There's also a rise of protectionistic attitudes, so that you want to protect, as it were, you criticize, you attack, as it were, those things that seek to threaten the identity of the people. And so, like again, with Pharisees who would want to maintain Jewish culture, Jewish traditions, and observance of the law, when they see someone like Jesus who seems to play light with certain particular laws like Sabbath observance, then they become concerned that these things that help to identify Israel as a particular people, as a unique people, are not being emphasized in the way in which they think they ought to be, that these laws are not being observed with the strictness that the Pharisees thought it should be. Now, of course, Pharisees were small in number throughout. I mean, Josephus will call them one of the largest groups of Jews, sects of Jews, he will call them, but still their numbers is small. And so there was a lot of people who were not Pharisees. And so I'm sure the Pharisees were critical of a lot of Jews who didn't practice or observe things as strictly as they did. Nevertheless, they will make some criticisms of Jesus because they see in some of his activities, though he's preaching repentance, he's again not observing the law, or he is not observing their traditions of law observance. So there is this growth of religious distinctiveness. So this emphasis on circumcision, Sabbath, kosher observance, staying away from unclean foods. So all these things become important. Again, this as well help to explain for Jews living outside of Palestine who have to interact with Gentiles a lot more. Some of these things were not practiced by the other peoples in the places they live. And some Jews may have liked to have given up some of these things, but other Jews would want to make sure that these particular laws were given a great deal of attention, because without them, Jews begin to end up looking more like Greeks or like non-Jews. So attacks against any of these could be treated very seriously. And so when we see Paul in the early Christian communities and some of the things that they were saying, and the inclusion of non-Jews into the Christian community as Israel and not requiring them to be circumcised, not requiring Gentiles to observe Sabbath, kosher, and yet calling them Israel, that was problematic. Now, in synagogues could welcome non-Jews to worship their God, but the non-Jew is always the non-Jew. He doesn't share the identity of being Israel. But with Christianity, they are claiming that non-Jews can be Israel, even when they are not observing these particular practices. And so there becomes tensions, and that's why we might find the book of Acts. Uh, there are what Luke describes as the Jews, probably meaning Jewish leaders or particular individuals in the Jewish community that want to attack Paul, particularly as the leader or the main spokesperson, who seems to be diluting these practices. All right, we will stop there as our kind of introduction to Hellenism and its spread within Semitic culture.